It was a bright autumn afternoon, the kind of day that reminded Clara why she loved her small town. The park near their home was scattered with golden leaves, a reminder of the fast-approaching winter. Sophie, her vibrant 5-year-old daughter, ran across the grass, her laughter filling the crisp air. She was wearing her favorite pink jacket, the one with the white bunny ears sewn on the hood, a jacket Clara had picked out herself. She had always been cautious with Sophie, more so since becoming a single mother. But today felt peaceful. Safe. Clara sat on a bench, close enough to keep an eye on her daughter but far enough to allow Sophie her independence. The park wasn't crowded, just a few children playing on the swings and slides, their parents chatting or watching with quiet attention. Clara took a deep breath, feeling a rare sense of calm. For once, work wasn't overwhelming, and Sophie was content. Everything seemed perfect. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her reverie. It was an email from her boss, asking for an update on a project she had been working on. Just a minute, she thought, pulling out her phone. She would check the message quickly, send a short reply, and then go back to watching Sophie. She looked up one more time, seeing Sophie near the swings, her little body silhouetted against the setting sun. She smiled. But when she looked down to type her reply, she was unaware that her life was about to change forever. When Clara looked up again, Sophie was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. Maybe Sophie had wandered behind one of the large oak trees. Maybe she had moved to the other side of the playground. Clara stood up, scanning the park. No sign of her. Panic, like a cold fist, gripped Clara's chest. She began calling Sophie's name, her voice starting calm but growing increasingly frantic. Sophie. Sophie, where are you? Other parents in the park started to take notice, their gazes following Clara as she began to run across the grass, checking behind trees, searching the corners of the playground, the public bathrooms, the nearby picnic tables. Sophie. Her voice cracked. Sophie. The minutes ticked by in agonizing slow motion. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts jumbled and incoherent. Had someone taken her? No, it couldn't be. Sophie was just hiding. Just playing a game. But as Clara searched every possible place her daughter could be, the sinking realization settled in her chest: Sophie was gone. A mother's worst nightmare had begun. By the time the police arrived, Clara was pacing the edge of the park, barely able to hold herself together. Her hands were shaking, her face pale, and her breath coming in short gasps. Officers in crisp uniforms asked her questions, but their words seemed distant and unreal. What time did she last see Sophie? What was Sophie wearing? Did she see anyone suspicious? Clara's mind was spinning, every answer she gave feeling inadequate, like she was failing her daughter with every missed detail. "We're going to do everything we can, ma'am," one of the officers said, placing a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. "We'll find your daughter." But Clara could barely process the words. Her entire world had narrowed to one thought: I lost her. She hadn't been paying attention. She had been distracted. This is my fault. A group of volunteers, including some of the parents from the park, began searching the area, combing through nearby streets and checking every nook and cranny of the town. Posters with Sophie's smiling face, taken just a few weeks earlier, were printed and plastered everywhere, on lampposts, in shop windows, at the community center. "Missing," they read, in bold letters that made Clara's stomach twist with dread. As the sun set and the park emptied out, Clara found herself standing alone in the spot where Sophie had last been seen. She dropped to her knees, her fingers clutching the grass, as if she could will her daughter back into existence. Sophie's bright laughter echoed in her mind, but now it felt like a distant memory, as if it belonged to another time, another life. Clara barely slept that night. She sat by the phone, waiting for news, any news, from the police. Every time it rang, her heart jumped into her throat, only for it to plummet again when it wasn't about Sophie. Her mind replayed the events over and over, wondering what she had missed, what she could have done differently. How could she have taken her eyes off Sophie, even for a moment? The guilt gnawed at her, a constant presence, whispering in her ear that this was all her fault. And as the days turned into weeks, that guilt only grew stronger. The search for Sophie was relentless, but the longer it went on, the more Clara felt like she was losing herself. The police had set up a task force, and Clara spent countless hours giving statements, reviewing the events of the day Sophie disappeared, and sitting through agonizing interviews with detectives who asked the same questions over and over. Each day without Sophie was torture. Leads came in, but they were always false hopes. There was the man at the gas station who claimed to have seen a little girl matching Sophie's description, but the surveillance footage showed a different child. Clara had driven hours to that gas station, hope fluttering wildly in her chest, only to feel it crash into despair when she realized it wasn't Sophie. Then there were the rumors. Some whispered that Sophie had wandered off and gotten lost. Others speculated that she had been abducted. Clara heard people talking behind her back, questioning her as a mother. How could she have let this happen, they would say, not knowing the burden those words added to her already broken heart. Worst of all were the scammers. As the case gained media attention, Clara began receiving calls from anonymous people claiming to have Sophie. They would demand ransom, offering vague details that could apply to any child. Clara wanted to believe them, desperate for any clue that might lead to her daughter. But each time, the police would investigate and confirm that it was just another cruel hoax. The emotional roller coaster was unbearable. Each false lead sent Clara spiraling deeper into despair. She would collapse into bed at night, her body numb with exhaustion, her mind filled with images of Sophie's face, her laughter, the way she would snuggle close to Clara during story time. The pain of her absence was suffocating. After 2 months, the case began to lose steam. The police still checked in with Clara, but the frequency of their visits had diminished. Clara knew what it meant, they were running out of leads. The investigation was slowing down. Clara refused to accept it. She couldn't just sit by and do nothing. If the police weren't going to find Sophie, she would. She started following up on tips herself, no matter how far-fetched or outlandish they seemed. She scoured social media, joining missing person forums and groups, searching for any mention of a little girl that matched Sophie's description. Her obsession grew. She stopped eating. Stopped sleeping. Her home, once a cozy refuge filled with Sophie's drawings on the fridge and her toys scattered across the floor, became a war zone of maps, notes, and newspaper clippings. Clara's world narrowed to one focus: finding Sophie. One suspect became her fixation, a man who had been seen loitering near the park the day Sophie disappeared. The police had questioned him early on, but without any evidence linking him to the case, they had let him go. Clara didn't care. In her mind, he was the key to finding Sophie. She began staking out his house, following him when he left, watching him from a distance. She was convinced that he knew something. One night, Clara followed him to a dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town. She sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The darkness around the cabin was suffocating, but in one of the windows, she thought she saw something, a flash of pink, the same color as Sophie's jacket. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dialed the police, her voice shaking. She was frantic, but for the first time in weeks, she felt hope. The police arrived at the cabin within the hour, a full team armed and ready. Clara watched from a distance, her stomach in knots as they moved in, breaking down the door and storming the cabin. She held her breath, her eyes fixed on the scene in front of her, praying that Sophie would be inside, safe and alive. When they brought Sophie out, Clara's legs gave way, and she collapsed to the ground, sobbing. Sophie looked small and fragile, her face pale, her eyes wide and haunted. But she was alive. Clara ran to her, scooping her up in her arms, holding her so tightly she was afraid she might never let go. Sophie clung to her, burying her face in Clara's shoulder, trembling but silent. Clara whispered words of comfort, though she wasn't sure if Sophie could hear them. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. You're safe now." But even as they drove away from the cabin, Clara knew that their journey was far from over. Sophie had been found, but the trauma of her disappearance lingered like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over both of their lives. In the weeks after Sophie's rescue, Clara tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. Sophie was different now. She barely spoke, and when she did, her words were quiet, hesitant. She refused to leave Clara's side, clinging to her at all times. The once happy, energetic child had become withdrawn and fearful. Clara enrolled Sophie in therapy, hoping that with time, the nightmares would fade and Sophie would start to heal. But the process was slow, agonizingly so. Sophie's therapist explained that it would take time for her to open up, to process what had happened to her. Clara nodded, but inside, she was screaming. She wanted Sophie to be okay now, to be the little girl she had lost. But that girl was gone, and in her place was a child who had seen things no 5-year-old should ever see. Clara, too, was struggling. The guilt still weighed heavily on her. She replayed the day of Sophie's disappearance over and over, wondering what she could have done differently. How could she have let this happen? What kind of mother was she to let her daughter be taken right in front of her eyes? Every night, when Sophie finally fell asleep, Clara would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her failure pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She knew that they were both alive, that they had survived, but sometimes that didn't feel like enough. But slowly, as the months passed, things began to change. Sophie started to smile again, little by little. She asked to go to the park one day, and though Clara's heart clenched with fear, she agreed. They went together, hand in hand, and though Sophie stayed close to her side, she laughed again, her eyes brightening as she played on the swings. It wasn't the same as before, but it was a start. And as Clara watched her daughter, she realized that healing would take time, but they would get through it, together.